Bob Schieffer, born in 1937 in Texas, began his journalism career at Texas Christian University. After graduating with a bachelor's in journalism, he began to work as a public affairs officer for the Air Force. Mr. Schieffer then began working at CBS and was assigned to the Pentagon, the White House, and was an anchor for the CBS Evening News. In 1982, he became Washington's chief correspondent and in 1991 began his tenure as hosting Face of the Nation. Mr. Schieffer hosted Face the Nation for the last time in May 2015. Mr. Schieffer is a recipient of 8 Emmys, a Press Club Award, the Paul White Award, and the Walter Cronkite Award. Additionally, he was named a Living Legend by the Library of Congress in 2008 and is recognized by many Americans as the host of several presidential debates. As a tribute to him, Texas Christian University named its communication school Bob Schieffer College of Communications in 2013. Further, Mr. Schieffer is the author of several books, including one many of us have read, Overload, Finding the Truth in Today's Deluge of News. The renowned journalist has kindly come today to tell us more, so please join me in welcoming Mr. Schieffer.
Thank you very much, and I'd say something on behalf of all authors. Thank you for reading my book, those of you who did. I've written 5 books over the years, and although quite frankly, my whole career has been about television. I started out as a newspaper reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which is my hometown down in Texas, and I've always thought of myself as a writer rather than as a television person or whatever you want to call it. And I still have to say that I get probably a bigger kick. I enjoy the circulation that you get on television because you get these enormous audiences. But just from the standpoint of craftsmanship, I like writing, and I get the most satisfaction out of that. I've always liked art, and I like abstract art, but I feel a lot better if I know the guy can draw, because I think drawing is the foundation of all art. And I'm the same way about journalism. I think writing is the foundation of all journalism. And to me, it's the part I still get the most satisfaction out of. But I was one of those unusual people. I know a lot of you are still thinking about, what do I want to be? What do I want to do? A lot of you know. But for some reason, I always wanted to be a reporter. My kids used to, when they were little, used to say, "Dad, did you always want to be a TV reporter?" And I said, well, actually, they didn't have TV when I was a little boy. They didn't have it till I was in the 8th grade. So we're going on and through this technological revolution now that in communications that has totally turned the world of journalism upside down because the way we get the news has totally changed. I mean, I spent my life getting up every morning and reading the newspaper. How many of you all read the paper newspaper? There you go. It's not very many anymore. But this is just generational. Now, how many of you do read the newspaper online? See, this shows, I still am trying to get used to that. And I think that's probably where our newspapers are going to go if they're going to survive. As many of you who did read my book understand, the coming of the web has just taken the life's blood away from the newspapers, and that is the advertising. It has just gone away, and as a result of that, a lot of people don't realize this. We have lost 126 newspapers over the last 12 years. 1 reporter in 5 now lives in Washington, in New York, or in Los Angeles. That tells you how many newspapers have just simply gone away because they can't find a business model. The good news in all of this is the New York Times and especially the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal have found a way to not only exist but to prosper in this time. The Post, which now has a circulation of about 400,000, the paper newspaper, now because they have shifted so much of their effort to digital, now will now reach as many as 70 million people in 1 month. That just shows you. It helps to have a billionaire owner, Jeff Bezos, but Bezos has wisely decided that he runs the business and he leaves it to the editor, Marty Barron, to run the newspaper. And that is the way to do it. What the Post has done is now they put equal emphasis. They don't hold their scoops till the newspaper comes out in the morning. They put them online immediately. But they concentrate not only on just straight news, they offer analysis, they offer podcasts. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post now have video departments, just like CBS News does. They have really found a way to do it, and it's working. The Post this year hired 30 reporters, and they may be the only newspaper in America that hired any reporters this year, but they hired 30. They beefed up their editorial department, and as a result of these changes that they're making, they are, the Post, the Times, and the Wall Street Journal are getting most of the scoops that are happening now in journalism. Not because they have reduced staff, but because they have added staff, and they're actually putting out a better product today than they were. Journalism is in better shape than we think it is, but it's still a new and a different place from where it used to be. I want to talk to you a little bit about whether you might be interested in being a reporter or what your view of journalism is. Where do you think it fits into our kind of government? I'll tell you something. I didn't get into journalism. This is a full confession, being transparent. I didn't get into journalism for any serious reason. I got into it because I thought it would be fun. And I've come to find out I was absolutely true about that. I can't think of anything I could have done or any way I could have filled my life and had more fun in the process. But I guess I was in the 9th grade, and this is what really convinced me. I was in the 9th grade, and in those days, high school was just 3 years, and 7th, 8th, and 9th were junior high school, where I grew up. So in the 9th grade, I was the sports editor of the school newspaper, and for the first time, when I wrote my first story and saw my first byline, it was the first time I'd seen my name in bold-faced type, and it just looked so fine. I just decided I want to do that again. I want to see that again, and so that was really what got me started. But from that year on, I always wanted to be a reporter, and I feel very fortunate because a lot of times what people think they want to do when they're a little boy is not what they wind up doing when they get to adulthood. I was very lucky. I got to do that. I was also very lucky in that I finally, and it took me a long time, I was first a newspaper reporter, and then I worked for a local television station. Then I got to CBS, which had been my goal, because Walter Cronkite had always been my hero, and I just wanted to be like Walter Cronkite. In fact, I still want to be like Walter Cronkite. I've never quite gotten to the level that he enjoyed in America. He truly was the most trusted man in America. But walking into the CBS bureau here in Washington was a day I will never forget. I felt like I was just a little leaguer who suddenly got called up to pinch hit in Yankee Stadium. I mean, that's how it was. All the people that I admired in journalism, most of them worked right there. And under the heading of there's always some surprise, sometimes you get a good break, sometimes you don't. I was an experienced reporter. I had been a reporter for about 10 years when I walked in there, and literally walked in there and got hired. Here's how it happened. I had been working in Washington, in Fort Worth, and I got hired by a company to come to Washington. They were going to form the 4th Network, and they were putting together a Washington bureau staff, and so they hired me. I got here. the plan they had to become the fourth network fell through. It was not a great job, and I went home and told my wife one day, you know, I think we've made a terrible mistake here. I think we ought to go back to Fort Worth. And my wife said, well, have you noticed something? And I said, what? She said, have you noticed that I'm pregnant? Said, you left me back there in Fort Worth to sell the house, arrange the move, and you went off to work in Washington. And she said, could we just do one thing? She said, could we wait till this baby comes? And then we can think about moving back. And so I obviously felt awful. And I said, yeah, sure, that's what we can do. So one day while we were waiting for the baby to come, I just went over to the CBS Washington Bureau at 2020 M Street. Now, mind you, there was no security and all that kind of thing in those days. I had tried and tried to get an appointment at CBS. I could never get an appointment. I'd get nice letters back saying we have nothing and all of that. But anyway, I just walked in, went to the second floor. The first person that I saw, I said, I'm Bob Schieffer. I've come here to see Mr. Small. He was the bureau chief, about a job. And whereupon this woman said, oh, yes, Bob, come right in. I was ushered, now mind you, I had no appointment. That's the first time anybody in that bureau had seen me. Was ushered into the bureau chief's office. I sat down, talked to him, and was subsequently hired by CBS. What I later found out was, and you could probably guess what I found out, I had walked in on someone else's appointment. And it was Bob Hager, who later went to work at NBC. And when I was writing one of my previous books, I called him one day, and I just suspected something might be. I said, I want to ask you something. I said, in the spring of 1969, did you have an appointment with Bill Small about applying for a job? And he said, yeah, he said, I think that's when it was. But he said, you know, nothing ever came of it. And NBC offered me a job, so I went to work there. So sometimes a little luck helps along the way, no matter who you are. I will say that the one lesson I learned about all that was, you know, the harder you work and the harder you try, the luckier you get. So that would be the first piece of advice if you all are thinking about it. You didn't come here to hear me discuss life choices with you, but that's just one thing to keep in mind. You never know what's going to happen the next day. So don't ever shut a door. You know, you're going to go down the street. Some doors will open that you didn't expect to open, and some days doors will close. So always keep that in mind. Well, let's talk a little bit about the role of the press. I'm going to assume that in your government classes, you've all talked a little bit about the First Amendment, right? Yeah. Somebody tell me what the First Amendment does. Why is it there? Who knows? How would you define the First Amendment? What does the First Amendment guarantee? What?
It states what the government can't take away from you. So the right to free speech, the right to petition, the right to freedom of the press,
and religion
and assembly.
Yeah. The First Amendment, many people say, is the most important. Somebody tell me why a lot of people say the First Amendment is first because. Who would finish that sentence? Think about it. It gives you the right to free speech. But why is it the first of 10 amendments, the first 10? Why?
It allows you to petition the government and get other rights restored if they were taken away. So it protects other rights by protecting those rights.
Basically what it does, it makes all the rest of them possible. That's the short answer. Your answer is correct. But basically, the First Amendment is the most important of all the amendments, and that's simply my analysis. I mean, other people might disagree. The First Amendment makes all the other amendments possible. So let's talk a little bit about what is the role of the press. The founders didn't write the First Amendment because they thought it'd be a fun thing for Bob Schieffer and everybody else who wanted to be a reporter to do. Why did they Why did they write the First Amendment? And what is its importance overall? What is it about the First Amendment that makes democracies different? Who'd like to? Yeah.
Well, it helps educate all the Americans about what our leaders in Washington are actually doing, and make sure that the politicians don't go unchecked.
That's exactly right. And why does that set democracy apart from, say, a totalitarian society, a dictatorship? One of you all in the first row. Why? What's different about us and Russia?
We can complain about the government.
Yeah, we can complain about the government. In a totalitarian society, always remember, the only source of information about the government is what? The government. I would guess that not many of us think that would be in any way superior to the way we run our business. So the press is always going to be controversial. I don't know, I mean, we know what President Trump thinks of the press, but I have to tell you, I don't know of a single president, and I've been in Washington, the first president I interviewed was Richard Nixon, way back there in the dark ages. I don't know a single president that's been president since I've been in Washington who really enjoyed what the press was writing about him when he was president. Later, they came perhaps to have an appreciation for it. Some of them still hate the press. But that's not the point. The press will never be the most liked people in the room. But that's not the assignment that the founders gave us. What the founders had in mind was that in our democracy, our citizens have access to independently gathered information which they can compare to the government's version of events. That's what makes our form of government different from other forms of government, totalitarian societies, dictatorships, and so on. Independently gathered information which they can compare to the government's version of events. And once citizens have those two things that they can refer to, the government's version and independently gathered information, then they can decide what to do. And they make the decisions. And that is our role in democracy. And that role is as crucial to a Western democracy as the right to vote. You can't have one without the other. And so, you know, we're all used to all kinds of names being called. I think the president set a new all-time low over the weekend when he called Chuck Todd, who used to be my competitor on Sunday morning, is still host of Meet the Press, called him an SOB. I just find that totally out of bounds, if for no other reason. It's just simply in bad taste. But the point I want to make is we're used to being called names. When the Nixon administration was in power, I was one of those who Vice President Agnew called a nattering nabob of negativity, which was a rather interesting phrase, but in fact it was. And you know, everybody finds some other name, but we don't worry too much about that. I mean, we laugh about it. Much of the time. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we get really mad. But while we don't worry about the names we're called, when people in government at any level or outside of government set out to destroy the press, we have to take that very seriously, because what they are doing is not attacking us personally. They're attacking one of the foundations of our democracy. And when that happens, we have to be very serious and we have to respond. Because when you're attacking one of the foundations of our government, that's like attacking the right to vote. Those are the foundations on which our government is built. And we have to be very careful when people set out to do that. That is the most important thing. If you don't remember one thing that I say today, or if you remember just one, it is this. The press provides our citizens independently gathered information that they can compare to the government's version of events. That is very valuable, and it is crucial to our democracy. Always remember that. That is the most important thing of all. Are any of you in here, and you won't be marked down if you say no, but are any of you in here thinking about going into journalism or thinking about being reporters? There's one back there. Two. It's still, you know, the fact that newspapers are going away, there are still a lot of jobs in journalism. And you have to go out and find them. They're not going to come knock on your door. But it's still a great way to spend your life. And it's not for everybody. You know, for one thing, you have to work a lot on Christmas, especially at the beginning, or in some other holiday. You have to work late hours, and you start out making not a great deal of pay. But it is a very rewarding occupation. And if I just could offer a couple of, I want to hear from you guys and hear what you're thinking about. But if I could just offer a couple of tips to you along the way, don't worry too much in the beginning. I mean, I think a lot of people your age, and I have 3 teenage granddaughters, I have 2 daughters as well. I think a lot of young people today feel a great deal of pressure to be successful, and that is to make a lot of money. Don't pick out something, and don't worry too much about being successful. Pick out something you really like to do, and if you get good at it, the success part will take care of itself. But make that decision yourself. I would never tell you to disregard the advice of your parents. They probably are the smartest people you know right now, and you should always take seriously what they say. But when you decide how you're going to spend your life, that has to be your decision. You make that decision. Find something you like to do, and it won't seem like work. I still go to work every day, and I'm a whole lot older than you are. Well, why is that? Because, you know, it's just fun. It's fascinating to me. If you want to be a reporter, the main thing, learn to write. That's a good thing. You ought to be able, when you graduate from high school, you ought to be able to write a sentence. A simple sentence. It starts with a noun and has the verb that comes second. Don't worry too much about parenthetical phrases. That doesn't work in journalism. And always remember, the reason Einstein became a famous scientist is not because he wrote scientific papers that nobody could understand. He took very complex issues and broke them down into parables and into examples that people could understand. The object of good writing is not to write something that you think will appeal to academics or will show how smart you are. The object of good writing is to explain in terms people can understand what you want them to know. That's just one of the things. But I would also say this, no matter what you're going into, journalism or geology or whatever it is, do it, choose it because it's something that you really enjoy and something that you really like. And the other part of this is don't be afraid to change. If you get into something for a couple of years and it's not working, it wasn't what you thought it was, just like that when I moved to Washington, I thought I was coming into one kind of job and it turned out it wasn't very good. Change. Do something else. You're young. Make your changes early on. What you don't want to do is when you get to be my age, think, you know, if I'd have just done this or that, I might have done it. I wish I'd have tried that. So don't be afraid to stretch. Don't be afraid to reach. You know, the sun in your sky is over here. The sun in my sky is way over here. You don't want to get to be my age and say, boy, I wish I'd have tried this, or I wish I'd have tried that. Maybe I could do it. And the other part is always understand there's always going to be somebody there that's going to tell you, well, that's silly, or you're not good enough to do that. They're always there. They're always there. And they're there because what they're telling you reflects more on them than it does on you. Most of the time, it's just a matter of simple jealousy. I mean, I still have people that tell me there are things that I can't do, or they're silly if I try. Don't worry about those people. I used to think, one day I'll get even with them. And then I discovered it doesn't matter. What they think doesn't matter. So just put that aside. But what you do want to do is remember the people who were there at various stages of your life that helped you. Always remember them. And always remember that what they did for you, you can do for other people. One of the great joys, if that's the word, and I don't use that word very much, but one of the great joys of my life right now is seeing the success that the young people who work for me have enjoyed. They did it. I didn't do it. But I feel so proud of them for what they learned when they were working with me and what they've gone on to do. One of them, I've had 3 remarkable assistants in recent years. One of them, Kaylee Hartung, you may have seen her on ESPN. She was a sports reporter for 5 years over there. She's now working at CNN. She was at ESPN first, and now she's at CNN, and she's kind of on the police beat. She shows up at every hurricane, every flood, every funeral, and she's really just terrific. And let me tell you something, the best training for a reporter is always the police beat, because most stories you show up and people are happy to see you. But on the police beat, you're stepping into the worst moment in someone's life every time you show up to cover a story. That's the best training. If you can learn under those kind of conditions to conduct your business, get the information you want, and do it in a business-like way, you're never going to be cowed by some on-the-make politician. You just don't pay much attention. But Kaylee is doing very well. My second assistant was Kylie Atwood. She is now covering the State Department for CBS. She's in Africa right now. She was over there when Secretary Tillerson got the surprise announcement, which he found out about on Twitter, it turns out. He found out at the same time. Apparently, it had some inkling that something might be up. But she's over there with him and wrote a long analysis on our email and CBS She's doing really, really great, and she's 28 years old, still at the very beginning of her career. And then finally, Lucy Boyd, who covered the campaign with me last year, she is now part of the investigative team at 60 Minutes. And just watching their progress, I think about it every day, and it makes my life happy. To think there's a lot of things to be discouraged about these days, but those are the things that make me feel very, very happy. So learn from the people you work with. Always show up. That great philosopher my mother once said, show up with a smile on your face and a shine on your shoes, and you're automatically going to be one step ahead of everybody else you're competing with. It's still very good advice. Show up on time, answer the phone. You know, you never know who's going to be on the phone, and I'm probably have the best example of that I can think of during that awful, when I worked at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, during that awful time, the weekend that President Kennedy was shot. Things were just going berserk on our city desk, as you can imagine. Calls were coming in. I picked up a phone, and a woman said, is there anybody there that can give me a ride to Dallas? And I said, well, lady, and I was shouting. I said, because it was so loud, I said, we don't run a taxi here, and besides, the president's been shot. And I'm getting ready to hang up the phone, and I hear this voice say, yes, I know, I heard on the radio, I think my son is the one that they have arrested. And it was Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. I forgot about that part about running a taxi service. I said, where do you live? Wrote down her address. Another reporter and I drove to the address on the west side of Fort Worth. There she stood on the curb. She got in the car with me, and I wrote the first really big story of my career, an exclusive interview with the assassin's mother. So don't let somebody else in the office answer the phone. You answer the phone. Don't wait to see who it is. It makes my wife so mad because I can't let a phone ring more than one ring. I just pick it up. It's part of my DNA. And she said, would you please look and see who's calling? You know, she said, it's just another telemarketer, and most of the time it is, but I don't know. I answer the phone before I realize I've picked up the phone, but it's not a bad habit in whatever job you wind up doing. So I'm going to stop my remarks right there. That's basically my story, and I'm going to stick to it, but I'd like to hear what's on your mind.
So in your book, you talked a lot about the deluge of news and how, as citizens, we have so many new options to receive this news. So that, coupled with this militancy against the press these days, how do you feel that we move past this era where we both have so many options and people are beginning to be more antagonistic against the ones that are spreading the truth?
Well, this is very, all of what you have mentioned are connected. And the way, when I was coming into journalism, it was much more simpler how we got the news and how we formed our opinions. In those days, there were usually, 3, or in some cities, 4 television stations, and every city had a good newspaper, or a newspaper. Some were better than others, but a fairly decent newspaper. And you didn't always agree with the editorials, but you took for granted that what appeared on the news pages or what was being reported on network television had been checked out. And, we didn't, in those days, newspapers or news organizations, they didn't print or broadcast anything until they checked out whether it was true, and like in Fort Worth, when I was a young reporter, about 10 days before every election, there'd be a report that some candidate had a girlfriend that lived on the east side. I don't know why, but that's where all the girlfriends lived. They all lived over on the east side. And so we'd get these reports, and they'd be anonymous tips and stuff like that, and we'd go check them out. And most of the time they didn't amount to anything. On the rare occasions that we did, then we might run that story if it amounted to anything. But now there's no longer those, we call those whisper campaigns. There's no longer a whisper campaign anymore. If somebody wants to put something out, true, false, or somewhere in between, they just put it on a blog. They put it in a tweet. And this leaves politicians in a real mess. They have to decide, do I ignore this and hope it goes away? Do I confirm it and give it more circulation? Well, what do I do with it? It's a harder thing for them to deal with than it is for us. I mean, we don't, in the mainstream media, we don't do print things unless we've checked them out and find out if they're true. But that's no longer the case with so many of these sites on the web. Back when you had 3 television stations and a newspaper in every town, compare that to where we are today. There are now 700 channels on your television set. There are more sites than that on the web. And so all of them, if you listen to this channel, you get one set of facts, and if you listen to this channel, you get another set of facts. So we're no longer all basing our opinions on the same common data, the same facts. And that, I think, more than anything else, is the reason the country is so deeply divided. And the credibility of the media suffers because we have these, for want of a better word, and we'll talk about this later, fake news, that is being broadcast. Mark Twain said one time that the truth, he said one time that a lie travels around the world and back while the truth is still putting its pants on. And that has never been more true than it is today. There are still a number of people who think we didn't go to the moon. There are still a number of people that think these kids, that after the Connecticut shooting, and that's been a while ago, that those were all actors. Now we see the same stories cropping up about these students down in Florida. I mean, this stuff is just on there without any foundation of truth. It's put on there for political reasons. It's domestic propaganda, and it's there for no other reason. But once it gets there, and why I mean, we've always had people who made up lies and stuff, but now it has such a wide circulation so quickly that once it's out there, it's all but impossible to take it down. I mean, how many people still believe, and a number of them do, that Barack Obama was not born in the United States? I mean, that's been fact-checked and re-fact-checked. There's absolutely no truth to that, but there is still a sizable percentage of Americans that believe it's true. So part of the credibility of the mainstream media, a lot of people have lost trust in that because of this stuff that we have nothing to do with. And because we have these echo chamber channels, which people tune into now not to find the news, but simply to confirm and verify what their preconceived notion is, it is more and more difficult. So we're the victims sometimes of circumstances we had nothing to do with. But that doesn't mean that it's not still a very serious thing. This whole business of fake news now and Russia. In my home state of Texas, during the campaign, there was a website called Heart of Texas. And it urged other Texans to organize, and there were rallies and things like that, to organize and secede from the Union. Well, it turned out that website was not put together by Texans. It was put together by Russian intelligence, which was disguising itself as a domestic website. The same intelligence agents also had a website down there called Blacktivist, which urged black people who had been abused by the police to kill white people. There was another website that urged white people to kill black people who had disrespected the flag. I mean, these people are serious. These people are not our friends. And I think you saw in this bizarre interview that Megyn Kelly had over the weekend with Vladimir Putin, when he denied that Russia had anything at all to do with the meddling in our elections. He said, you know, maybe it was the work of Ukrainians, or said maybe it was the work of Russian Jews. In other words, if you're a Jew in Russia, you have a different kind of classification than just being a citizen of Russia. So my thought on that is that tells us about all we need to know about Vladimir Putin. This is not our friend. Who else? Yeah.
I completely agree with you.
You what?
Oh, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of issues, and it's especially a difficult time because we're facing not only the legitimization of fake news and untruths, but also a lack of trust in real news. So how do you think we can address this? I think it's very urgent. And so how do you think we should?
Well, I'll tell you what it is, what we have to do. You can't rebut every lie individually. I mean, there are just so many of them out there. What you have to do, what we have to do is to hopefully inoculate people to understand what is going on. I mean, what's going on here is exactly what's going on all across Europe. And a good part of it, not all of it, but a good part of it is, again, the Russians at work. Let me just say a little bit about that. The Russians don't drive their tanks across borders anymore. They found a much cheaper and really more effective way to gain control in a lot of these countries. Vladimir Putin is trying to reassemble the Soviet Union by bringing these republics that became independent after the Soviet Union fell back together. And at CSIS, which is one of the think tanks here in Washington where I'm affiliated with now, a woman, a scholar named Heather Conley, did a book actually last year called The Russian Playbook, where she went in and analyzed what the Russians were doing in 5 different countries over there. And what they do is they, number one, try to destroy the credibility of the media. That's their first objective. Then they bribe local officials. They make sweetheart deals with local entrepreneurs, especially real estate people, by loaning them money and all that kind of thing. And it's working. It's working. I mean, you go into these countries now and they still have the same name, but basically they're once again under the control of Russia. So to people who say the Russians didn't meddle in our election, if they didn't, we're the only developed country in the Western world where they didn't meddle. So we just have to do a better job of explaining to people and hoping we can present evidence to show what's going on here. And it's the same on all of these information sites, especially in Germany right now. The Russians are spending a lot of their time, there, and so it's making people aware of what's going on rather than trying to rebut every single lie that pops up. But it's just an enormous problem.
So in my household, we do watch a lot of media, but it's not from the U.S. So as someone who's interested in journalism in another country, what advice do you have?
Where, what do you watch from what country?
Well, my parents watched Al Jazeera for a while. We're from Egypt, and then we stopped watching just because of there was a trial with Al Jazeera journalists who kind of interviewed the Muslim Brotherhood, and so there was some sort of inconsistencies. So my parents kind of relied now on like BBC and British broadcast, a lot of British broadcasting companies. So.
Well, those are excellent sources. Yeah. I think the bottom line answer, I would say, and I'd say this to each and every one of you, don't depend on one source for your information, and don't make up your mind about how you feel about any issue unless you have visited a variety of sources. There's some very good websites right now. The Vox network, those are, most of them are specialized, like for business news and things like that. Axios is now a very good site. Politico is kind of getting to be the place for old people. I mean, it hadn't been around very long, but it is really an excellent source for political information. One of the things I did in this book, we put together a list of sites that we thought were reputable, or at least gave some description of what they were. And I got to tell you, I still think the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal are doing the best jobs in journalism right now, because, they just, where these papers used to have 2 White House correspondents, that would be it. Now they got 6 or 8. And they just have the resources to really, cover the world. So I would recommend all of them. But the worst, the thing I would most advise you to do is get a variety of sources. Don't depend on any one source to get your news.
Thank you.
Who else?
Hi, I was just wondering, who's the most challenging person you've ever had to interview, and how did you handle that?
Who's the most challenging?
Yeah, what's the most challenging interview you've ever had to give?
Every president, that's challenging, and it's also the most fun. When people ask me, who would you really like to interview? I'd like to interview this Pope, because not every Pope, but this one, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but I just think he's a very interesting person. I'm thinking back, this woman that was the Bill Clinton's Attorney General, who was that? Who? Janet Reno, yes. It's coming, folks. You'll discover where it's harder and harder to remember names and things. She was the nicest person in the world. But every time she would come on Face the Nation, she would preface every question, every answer, by saying, as I have said many times before. Well, I mean, that was just, when she would say that, you could hear refrigerator doors closing, toilets flushing all over America, because people said, well, she's already said whatever it is she's going to say, so I don't have to worry about that. She was a very difficult person to interview. I got into a real argument with Herman Cain. I don't know if any of you all remember him. And he had, that was, I guess, in the 2012 campaign. And he had run an ad that had a guy standing, and what really irritated me most of all, standing in front of CBS, and there was a CBS sign, smoking a cigarette, taking deep drags off this cigarette. And I asked him, what is the purpose of that? And he said, well, it's just to show we're cool. And I said, so you think smoking is cool? And he said, no, I didn't say that. I said, well, that seems to be what it suggests. I think smoking is not good for you. I've had cancer. I'm a cancer survivor. He said, well, I wasn't advocating that people should smoke. And I said, but you're saying you thought that was cool. And he said, well, I didn't kind of mean it that way. So I said, are you saying it's not cool? I said, how would you like to say right here on television, smoking is not cool, and I advise everybody not to do it? And he did. And I was kind of proud of that. You know, I once had John Boehner on, who I like very much. And he was talking about doing something in a bipartisan way. And I said, well, why don't you and President Obama, I said, you smoke, he smokes, why don't the two of you stop smoking? And that'll be a bipartisan thing. I said, I think that. Well, he said, well, I appreciate you saying that. But he said, this is my life, and this is what I choose to do. And I said, well, I don't think that's a good idea. And anyway, it went on and on. But that was another kind of a feisty kind of interview. But in their own way, I mean, I enjoy interviewing all of them. I mean, and Boehner, I would have to say, Boehner said the thing, if I had to remember one thing about the campaign of 2016, I must say one of my favorite moments was when John Boehner, who was still the Speaker of the House, said that Ted Cruz was Lucifer in the flesh. But here's what happened next. The Devil Worshippers Society put out a written press release and denied it, said he's not one of us. You don't get those very often. But those were just some of the interviews. You know who my favorite interview was? I interviewed all of the presidents, but I still think there's some people, Maya Angelou was a wonderful interview. I mean, she was just wonderful. I mean, she was funny. But I got to say, I think my favorite one was the one I did last year with Willie Nelson. And I've kind of known Willie down through the years, and he's just a great interview. I mean, everything he says is funny. You know, I said, and I asked him some hard questions. I said to him, Willie, I said, I've got to ask you about this marijuana. He said, you got one? He said that on television. But he's also a wonderful, wonderful person. And so it's not always the highest ranking person that's the most fun to interview. Sometimes it's people like that. Hi.
How do you think, based on your experience, like the journalistic scene in America is going to look like 50 years from now?
How's it going to look?
Yeah.
50 years from now?
Sure.
I think it probably won't be evening news programs anymore. I think they'll go the way of the evening newspapers. You know, every town used to have an evening newspaper, and they just went away. I think the morning shows will probably still be there because that's the one time period where you can tell people something they don't already know, probably. So I think they'll be there. I think programs like 60 Minutes and Face the Nation will still be there. But I think most of the hard news programs will go to the stream. You know, CBS now, we have this organization called CBSN, which you get on your computer or on your phone, and you don't get it on your television set unless you go through Hulu or something like that. I think that's where they will be. I'm not sure that the evening news programs will be there at all, but I think programs like 60 Minutes, which do in-depth reporting, and Face the Nation, Meet the Press, and so forth, I think they will still be there. But there's no way to really know. I mean, because we don't know what this technology. It's just amazing, these technological changes. And when I said, you know, there was no television when I was, you know, a little boy, you know, nobody wanted to be a TV reporter when I was a little boy, but the other part is nobody wanted to be an astronaut. You know why? There was no space program. So when you think of how far we've come from there, and then how far and how fast all of these changes are moving now, who knows? There may be some chip that they'll put in the side of our head, and we'll get the news from that. I mean, it's just amazing, all of this stuff. You know, cars that drive themselves and all of that. You guys are going to grow up in a very exciting time, I think. I'm very jealous of you. I mean, just as a reporter, I'd like to be there just to see these things happen. But it's going to be interesting. Anybody else? Aha,
So I'm pretty sure that being a journalist right now is pretty different than being a journalist like 20 or 30 years ago. So what do you think, in your opinion, are the qualities that every journalist of our time should have?
That's a very good question. Number one is curiosity. That's Walter Cronkite. I always tell the stories about Walter, that he was the most curious person I've ever known. He could always think of a question to ask you when you're a reporter like me, that nobody else had thought about. And I mean, he was just interested in everything. Walter would be walking down the street here, and if somebody walked up to him, and of course there were no selfies in his day, but they would stop and talk to him, and the next thing you know, Walter never brushed off anybody. I never saw him be rude to a single person. He not only was not rude, he was interested in them. And the next thing you know, he'd be asking them questions. Well, what do you think is going to happen here? Or how do you feel about guns and all of that? What do you think about these kids down there in Florida? I mean, that's just the way he was just curious about everything. And I think the second quality is learn early on to be a clear writer. And the third part is always tell the truth. Journalism is based on the truth. The politicians deliver messages. Our job is to find out what the truth is and then report that to people. But it's also, you have to have a certain nosiness. I mean, I was just one of those people that I love going behind police lines. You know, I love being the one that had a pass and I could step under that yellow thing there. And I love talking to these people especially because I started out, I was a police reporter for a long time. You just see a side of life that most people don't see. And what you learn is that there's not much new under the sun. People just have different weapons, different tools. But most of us are still motivated by the things that have always motivated people. And but it's just fun. I mean, you know, to hear somebody explain to you why they killed somebody or something like that. You don't normally hear people talk about things like that, but on the police beat, you always do. So that's the part. But be curious. Don't be afraid to ask questions, but learn to ask them in a civil way. You know, I think young reporters always make the mistake sometimes of worrying too much about how they sound when they ask a question rather than listening to what the person is telling them. This is one of the main the main problems that young journalists have to learn to overcome. And don't ever be embarrassed to ask a question. I think a lot of people, and this goes for anything, any profession, a lot of people say, I don't want to ask him that because I know what he'll say, and he'll think I'm dumb, that I don't know the answer. Well, that's not the purpose of asking a question, because you don't know what they're going to say. And that's a great mistake that a lot of reporters ask. I'm not going to ask him that because I know what he'll say. Well, every time I've ever done that, somebody else came along and asked the question, and I got scooped. And so don't be embarrassed about asking questions, but there are ways to ask them. I'm not saying in a polite way, in a business-like way. You don't have to be antagonistic, but you do want to be aggressive. And that's what I think the qualities are for being a reporter. Anybody else? Here's one.
I think this is our last question.
Okay.
So President Trump likes to use Twitter a lot, and I was just wondering what your opinion is on him using this more informal channel to kind of spread news and how it impacts your job as a journalist.
I've got to say something. I don't quote Martin Van Buren very often, but I ran across a quote from Martin Van Buren, and I don't even remember which president he was, but he was president, where he said, good government is based not on the excitement of the moment, but on sound, considered second thought. And I think that's very good. I mean, I think Twitter is a wonderful tool, but I think he tweets too much. I'll just say that without question. And sometimes Martin Van Buren was right. You need to kind of think about something before you say it. I think most of us have learned that the person who speaks first is often the person who knows the least, but is anxious to get his view out there. I kind of like to, when people kind of wait a little bit before they put out something like that. But, the other part of it is, I have always believed that the most successful politicians are the ones that have mastered what is the dominant medium of their time. I mean, the founders were great writers when most people got their news by the written word. Franklin Roosevelt was the first to understand the power of radio. And, up until that point, politicians would get on the radio and they would speak like they were speaking to a crowd of 40,000 in the Rose Bowl or something. Roosevelt understood that people were sitting around the kitchen table, and that's why his fireside chats were so successful. John Kennedy was the first to master television, and still was better at live television and presidential news conferences than anybody that's come after him. Now, are we going to look back on this day and say that Trump was the one who was the most successful at using Twitter? I really don't think so. But he, it's kind of his trademark. And I think it's fine for announcing things, but I mean, just to make policy on Twitter, I just don't think I think it opens you to so much, to mistakes. I mean, and think about how he has said these things on Twitter, and then next day they get walked back. When the president talks, I kind of like him to be the last word, not the first word. And I think most presidencies that have been successful, they have followed those practices. So, okay, well, thank you guys, and I really appreciate you. The fate of the world is in your hands because my generation screwed it up. And so you got your work cut out for you, and I'll be pulling for you. Thank you so much. Okay.
That was great.
Hi, I'm Caroline Fox, a print editor at Theogony.
I'm Griffin Harris, an online editor at Theogony. I'm Margot Wagner, a print editor at Theogony.
We're here today to interview longtime CBS correspondent Bob Schieffer.
So in the past decade, outlets like BuzzFeed have come, and there's been a rise of more partisan news outlets. With the increasing prevalence of online and social media news, is the era of unbiased news essentially over?
No, I don't think so, but there is a lot of biased, opinion that's on the web and also on some of the, what I call the validation channels on cable, and that is the channels where people tune in because they're going to hear the news presented from one particular point of view. There's nothing wrong with that, but the other part is you should understand what you're listening and watching when you tune into those channels. But I think there are a lot of reliable websites and reliable cable channels. But the problem is there are just so many. When I wrote this book, This Just In, I asked the question, we have access to more information than any people who have ever lived on the earth in the history of the world. But are we more informed? Are we wiser? Or are we simply overwhelmed with so much information that we can't process it? And the short answer is we're overwhelmed. There's no way that we could possibly process all the information that we're getting today. So what we have to do, we have to be very selective and very careful about where we get our news. Know what this website or this channel's reputation is, and know, are they somebody that they don't print or broadcast something until they've checked it out? Because what's happened now is a lot of people are getting their news on social media, Facebook. And the difference in Facebook and mainline journalism is they don't check out anything, obviously. This is generally people writing for various reasons, to keep up with their family and all that kind of thing, but it's not always true, and you just have to be aware of that.
So to follow up, are more journalists and more platforms a good thing for the electorate, or do they pose a threat to the truth?
They in the long run, they will be good, but it's like the invention of the printing press. You know, we all remember the great things, the great changes that happened after the invention of the printing press. Literacy across Europe spread rapidly. We had the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. What we sometimes forget is that there was always 30 years of religious wars that came after the invention of the printing press, and so it was about 3 decades before Europe settled into any kind of equilibrium. We're at the very beginning of our communications technology revolution, and eventually it will strengthen journalism and our culture in general, but we're not there yet, and it's going to be kind of a bumpy ride for a while.
Okay, our second question is, you mentioned in Overload that Donald Trump was the most unusual candidate that you've ever covered, and we were wondering, do you think that most well-regarded publications like The Post or The Times have done a fair job of reporting on Trump's presidency as well as his campaign? I do. I do think they have done a good job, and I think they have presented Donald Trump as he is. I have not changed my opinion when I wrote he's the most unusual candidate that I've ever covered. And I've interviewed him for years. I mean, the first time I interviewed him was way back there when the city of New York could not get the ice to freeze over in the skating rink in Central Park. And they'd spent about $11 million trying to do it. And he was a young businessman. He said, let me do it. He said, I can fix that. And in 3 months, he had people skating in Central Park. And it was a great story, you know. I mean, it was a story of, you know, bureaucratic bumbling being overcome by private enterprise. And so it was a very well-received story. Even he liked it. Well, you know, he would like that story. But having said that, I mean, I just think, you know,
government, running the government on kind of spur of the moment and at the spurt of some idea is not a good way to run the government. A lot of the problems that he is having is not about policy, but because he and the people around him are so strikingly unfamiliar with process and how it works. Which button do you push to get this result? And he is the first president that was neither in the military nor in office, any kind of political office. And in many ways, that's not a disqualifier. But there are certain things to learn, and you need somebody that when you move into the White House can tell you the men's room is down this hall and the ladies' room is down this hall. And most of the people that he has brought into the government were from the fringes of American politics and really had not been in office and had very little understanding of how the government works. And we're still kind of in a shakedown cruise.
You mentioned sort of his ability, or Trump's scandals. Has the mainstream media lost its ability to set the agenda and keep public attention focused on big questions? In the past, things like Monica Lewinsky or a president refusing to release his tax returns would dominate headlines for weeks, months. Now they seem to glaze over.
Well, we've got some stormy weather right now that we're dealing with that seems to keep popping up. So I don't know where that comes down. But I think one of the problems that Donald Trump has had is he'll announce some initiative and then kind of step on his own story, as we say in journalism. Then he'll make one of these offhand remarks, and suddenly that's what's going on. Donald Trump, that was one of the ways that he got elected. Was by dominating the conversation, and the way he would do it, I don't know if he knew what he was doing had a name, but it's what a political consultant named Linton Crosby once dubbed the dead cat theory, or the dead cat strategy. And that strategy was, if you're having a dinner party, and no matter what you're talking about, if somebody throws a dead cat in the middle of the table, everybody's going to start talking about the dead cat. Well, over and over again during this campaign, Donald Trump would get on television early in the morning on Morning Joe or something like that, or he'd tweet out one of these early morning news things, and no matter where the conversation about the campaign was, he'd get on and say something outrageous, and for the rest of the day, all of the politicians, all of the candidates were suddenly talking about him. And he was able to dominate the conversation. It was an unorthodox way to win the presidency, but it worked. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure it is the wisest way to run a government.
I want to switch now from the outward results of your profession to maybe the inward workings. Yeah. Since September, some of the biggest names have been taken down by cases of sexual abuse. Yeah. Mark Halperin, Matt Lauer, Charlie Rose. Yeah. Is there something more fundamental about the culture of TV news that allows this sort of behavior? After 3, it can't just be bad apples.
Well, I mean, you're seeing it in other organizations as well. The New York Times has had a couple of events, obviously show business, right, and what's going on in Hollywood. These things are awful, and they have to be taken seriously, and they can't be tolerated. And I think we all have to be aware of that. I mean, I've had people say to me, some of these people I know, I had no idea that any of this was going on. I think in some cases there have been people in positions of power who thought they were just so charming that people welcome these kind of advances, and maybe they didn't realize that no, what you're doing is not welcome. I've got 3 granddaughters. I've got 2 daughters. All of them. My daughters were both interns up on Capitol Hill. I mean, I wouldn't want somebody doing things like that, and it just can't be tolerated. But I must say, among some of those that I've known about, I was just stunned. And I was talking to a couple of young women at CBS yesterday, and we were talking about this, and one of them said to me, he said, it's interesting, and she mentioned a person, one of people at CBS. She said, when this came out, all of the guys were surprised. All of the older people were surprised, but said everybody under 30, we weren't surprised. And so that just shows you how, you know, kind of compartmentalized we are, if nothing else, by age groups. But we have to take this seriously, and we can't be doing stories about other people unless our skirts are clean, and it's very tragic, but that's the way it is.
So you mentioned in one of your books that before a group interview, Barbara Walters complained about being seen as a pushy cookie if she asked the tough questions, which you and other male journalists are praised for. Do you think the industry's like that, and why do you think?
No, I think it's just public perception. And she's absolutely right about that. And Barbara is the single best competitor that I ever went up against. I mean, she would often travel when I was White House correspondent. She would travel with us, and I mean, you had to watch her every second of the day because, and I mean, she wasn't doing anything unfair. She's just a really good reporter, and she just never stops working. But sometimes women, because they have a generally higher pitched voice, they will often come across as shrill when men who have lower voices don't. They come across with a different tone. I mean, this is what Barbara would say. And that's why she said that. And she said, you know, I get accused of being a pushy cookie when you guys said everybody thinks you're great when you ask these hard questions. But she put her finger on it. She's absolutely right about that. And I think that women are now more accepted. I mean, you know, journalism is just like everything else in our country. You know, men dominated so many years. The women had to do twice as much work to be seen as equal. Well, I think that's changing now. And I think Barbara would not be seen that way today. But she was talking about something that was a real problem for women. But, you know, now, when I worked at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the only women who worked at the newspaper worked in the society department. I think we may have had one that worked on the city desk and covered the real news. Now most of the reporters are women. I mean, you look at CBS, all of our top reporters, most of them are women. I mean, Margaret Brennan was just named the anchor of Face the Nation. Holly Williams, just an outstanding journalist, and in the Middle East, and has snuck in and out of Syria and goes to all these places. Clarissa Ward, that used to work for us until she decided to go to work at CNN because they made her an offer she couldn't refuse. They go into the toughest and the hardest places now, and nobody even thinks about that anymore. Well, that's great when people are not thinking about this. There was a great friend of mine named Chappie James, who was a general in the Air Force, and he was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. And he said, you know, when you start talking about race, he said, or gender, he said, when you talk about the only one or the first one, he said, that's great, but you've got to get past that. And I think we're far past that now, certainly in journalism.
Speaking of women in journalism, the new movie The Post suggested that Katharine Graham's closeness to public figures like Robert McNamara or Ben Bradley's closeness to JFK blurred their ability to be objective. Have you ever felt that your relationship with a public official has conflicted with your role as a journalist?
You know, really, no. But I guess everybody feels that way. Probably it may have, you know. But let me just say something about Katharine Graham. She is one of the most remarkable people that I have ever met. And think about before the story that was told in the movie The Post, Katharine Graham had become publisher of that paper because her husband had committed suicide after having this notorious affair with another woman. So she had just come through all of that, and suddenly here she is presented with, you're the publisher of the Washington Post. The smartest thing she did was to hire Ben Bradley, who's one of the great editors of our time. And she had some very tough decisions to make in an area where she didn't know all that much about how a newspaper functioned and how it worked. But she depended and she hired people who did know how it worked, and she learned from them. And the Post, I mean, this was, you know, the New York Times, they all kind of got their nose out of joint about that movie because they said, look, we're the ones that printed the Pentagon Papers. They just caught up with us. But yes, but this was the story of Katharine Graham. It was not the story of the Pentagon Papers. But they did it, and the viability, the financial viability of this newspaper was at stake. This was not something they could just do and, okay, if it doesn't work, we'll be cool. If it hadn't worked, they would have lost the Post. That's all there was. So I have great admiration for her.
All right, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. We appreciate taking.
You guys give me hope. My generation didn't do a very good job, I'm afraid, in a lot of different areas. I don't mean just in journalism, but your generation's going to have to unravel, I think, a lot of what we did and figure out what to do from there on. And the young people I meet today, I come away always impressed. And this most recent example of what young people can do, we saw down in Florida. I think that was remarkable. And I think finally it might lead to something be done in a meaningful way. I mean, those kids, they don't know anything about politics. They don't know anything about lobbyists. They don't know anything about a lot of the things that we all worry about. They just know that when 640 people die in a year and a half, that's how many have died since the Orlando club shooting, and 2,635 have been wounded. They just know that's not right, and they feel that adults have let them down. So they've taken the issue into their own hands. And I think when you see what the Florida governor did, when you see what Dick's Sporting Goods did, when they said, we're just not going to sell these weapons of war anymore, that's a direct result of what those kids did. And so I hope you guys will understand that the power that you have, even at a very early age, and you will not be afraid to use it.
Kind of you to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.